What if Kristen's revenge doesn't hit the target she intended, and instead destroys someone far more vulnerable? Days of Our Lives may be setting up one of its darkest turns yet, because Kristen DiMera and Sophia Choi are no longer just talking about payback. They are moving towards something far more dangerous, a plot so reckless, so emotionally driven, that one wrong move could change everything. And the truly terrifying part is this: Johnny may not be the one who pays the price first. Because the more this story unfolds, the more Chanel starts to feel like the real danger zone. Kristen blaming EJ for everything that happened to Rachel gives this story its emotional spark, but the more important shift is what she chooses to do with that anger. She is no longer looking for an argument, a warning, or even leverage. She wants damage, real damage. The kind that hits EJ in the most personal place possible and leaves a wound that cannot be cleaned up with excuses later. That is why Johnny matters so much in this setup. He is not just EJ's son. He is part of EJ's emotional legacy, part of the future he still wants control over, and part of the family image he wants to preserve. So if Kristen is aiming at Johnny, she is not simply attacking one man. She is going after everything surrounding him: his marriage, his unborn child, and the life he is trying to build with Chanel. Krist is not just lashing out blindly. She seems to believe that if EJ made Rachel suffer, then he deserves to feel that same helplessness through someone he loves. That mindset is what makes her especially dangerous here. Once a character starts treating cruelty as justice, the line between revenge and catastrophe disappears very quickly. And that is exactly why Chanel already feels exposed, even before anything has happened to her directly. She may not be Kristen's intended target, but she is tied too closely to Johnny to remain untouched by whatever comes next. If Kristen destabilizes Johnny's world, Chanel is automatically standing in the fallout zone. In stories like this, the threat rarely stays confined to the original target. It spreads, it hits the wrong person, and sometimes the person standing closest to love, hope, and vulnerability ends up absorbing the worst blow of all. If Kristen were doing this alone, the story would already be dangerous. But Sophia's involvement changes the structure of the threat completely, because Sophia does not bring stability to this alliance. She brings volatility. Kristen may be driven by revenge, but Sophia is being pulled in by something even messier: personal resentment, emotional immaturity, and her own desire to bring Holly down. That means this is no longer a plan built around one objective. It is now a collision of grudges. And once a scheme starts serving multiple emotional agendas at the same time, it usually becomes harder to control and much easier to derail. Sophia is not entering this partnership like someone carefully following instructions. She is entering it with anger of her own, which makes her more likely to improvise, overreact, or push things too far at the worst possible moment. Because the disaster here may not come from some cold, flawlessly executed move against Johnny. It may come from the cracks inside the alliance itself. A rushed decision, a wrong assumption, someone appearing where they were not supposed to be, someone panicking after the plan begins to slip. In other words, the real threat may not be precision. It may be disorder. And soap chaos becomes far more frightening when innocent people are standing nearby. That is why Chanel's position in this story feels so important. She is not driving the conflict, but she may be the one most vulnerable to the mistakes it creates. Kristen sees Johnny as the weapon against EJ. Sophia sees Holly as unfinished business. But Chanel is the person caught between unstable motives, reckless timing, and an agenda that is already too emotionally messy to stay under control. So this partnership should not be viewed as Kristen gaining an extra set of hands. It should be viewed as Kristen inviting unpredictability into an already dangerous plot. And that often leads to consequences no one in the alliance is actually prepared to face. This is the point where the story stops feeling like a dark setup and starts feeling genuinely alarming. Because Chanel is not just emotionally connected to Johnny, she is physically vulnerable in a way that raises the stakes of every single wrong move. Her pregnancy changes the entire emotional weight of this storyline. Suddenly, this is not just about whether revenge goes too far. It is about whether one reckless act could threaten two lives at once. The show has already leaned into his anxiety about Chanel and the pregnancy, and that kind of repeated concern is rarely accidental in a soap. When a character keeps voicing dread, the writers are usually doing more than showing personality. They are setting a tone. They are planting emotional tension in advance, so that if something does go wrong, the audience feels that it was building beneath the surface all along. Chanel hears Johnny's fear and treats it like worry that has gotten out of hand. She seems to believe he is imagining disaster before there is any reason to. But the audience is being invited to read that differently. His nervousness may not be irrational at all. It may be the show's way of quietly signaling that danger is already moving closer than either of them realizes. And that is what makes Chanel's possible role in this story so heartbreaking. She would have no reason to suspect that Kristen and Sophia's alliance could directly affect her. Johnny would not suspect it either, because his fear is centered on the pregnancy itself, natural complications, stress, uncertainty, not on the possibility that an outside plot could violently collide with their future. That gap in awareness makes the threat much more painful, because it means neither of them is looking in the right direction. If Chanel becomes the one who gets hurt, Johnny's emotional collapse would not just come from shock. It would come from guilt. He would almost certainly replay every moment of his worry and start questioning whether he missed something, whether he should have acted sooner, whether his instincts were warning him about a danger he failed to understand. Because once Johnny's fear shifts from abstract dread to real consequence, the story no longer belongs only to Kristen's revenge plot. It becomes a much larger emotional disaster, one centered on loss, guilt, and the unbearable possibility that Chanel and the baby paid the price for a scheme that was never even meant for them in the first place. What gives this storyline its real power is not just the plot itself, but the possibility that everyone involved may be moving toward a result none of them actually intended to create. Kristen believes she is striking at EJ by going through Johnny. Sophia seems willing to help as long as her own anger finds an outlet too. On paper, that makes the scheme look targeted. But in reality, plans driven by revenge rarely stay that clean for very long. Once emotion starts guiding the timing, the pressure, and the choices, the original target can shift in an instant. If Chanel ends up hurt instead of Johnny, the story changes immediately. The emotional tone changes. The moral balance changes. Even the meaning of the revenge changes. Because there is a major difference between plotting against someone you blame and causing harm to a pregnant woman who was never supposed to be the direct focus of the attack. At that point, this is no longer a revenge story operating in gray territory. It becomes a full-scale tragedy. And that matters because neither Kristen nor Sophia feels truly prepared for that level of fallout. Sophia may talk tough and lean into vindictive impulses, but there is a real chance she would unravel the second the consequences became real. Wanting someone to suffer from a distance is one thing. Watching a plan spiral into irreversible damage is something else entirely. The same may be true for Kristen. She may believe she can manage the risk now, but once a scheme produces visible devastation, control becomes much harder to reclaim. The people pushing this plan forward may not be ready for the emotional wreckage it creates once events move beyond their intentions. And if Chanel is the one who pays the price, then the aftermath will not just wound Johnny. It could permanently alter how he sees everyone around him. Because for Johnny, that would be the moment everything breaks at once. If Chanel collapses because she was caught in something meant for him, then his fear stops being anxiety and becomes reality. In one instant, Every worry he carried about the pregnancy would take on a much darker meaning. He would not just be dealing with panic. He would be living through the exact nightmare he never wanted to name out loud. That is why this story feels so dangerous right now. Not because the setup is overly complicated, but because one wrong move could unleash consequences far bigger than the people behind it seem able to understand. What makes this storyline especially unsettling is that it may not matter whether Kristen and Sophia fully succeed. The disaster may come from the collapse of the plan itself. That is often when Days of Our Lives is at its strongest in suspense-driven stories. The tension is not always about whether the scheme works exactly as intended. Sometimes the real damage comes when a bad plan slips out of control, fragments under pressure, and starts hurting people in ways no one anticipated. In that kind of setup, failure can be just as destructive as success. And this alliance already carries that energy. Kristen is operating from rage, which means her judgment is compromised even if she believes she is thinking clearly. Sophia is operating from resentment and impulsive emotion, which makes her even less reliable once pressure builds. Put those two forces together, and the story stops feeling like a calculated mission. It starts feeling like a setup for miscalculation, panic, and permanent fallout. That is why Chanel feels so dangerously positioned in all of this. She is standing closest to the emotional center of the story without fully recognizing the threat around her. Johnny senses that something could go wrong, but he is looking at the pregnancy through the lens of fear, not sabotage. Kristen is consumed enough by revenge to cross lines she may not be able to uncross. Sophia is unstable enough to turn one bad situation into something worse. None of these elements point toward a narrow escape. Together, they point toward impact. The suspense here no longer comes from wondering whether chaos is coming. Chaos is coming. The real question is what form it takes once it arrives. Does Chanel become the accidental victim? Does Johnny lose the future he has been trying so desperately to protect? Does Sophia crack under the weight of what she helped set in motion? Does Kristen finally push so far that even she cannot rationalize the damage anymore? Those are the questions now driving the story forward. Because if Chanel is pulled into the center of this disaster, then this may not be a temporary scare or a simple plot twist. It could be the beginning of a much darker chapter. One built not just on revenge, but on guilt, trauma, and consequences that continue long after the original scheme falls apart. So what do you think? Is Chanel really the one in the most danger? And could Kristen and Sophia's revenge plot lead to a devastating tragedy that changes everything for Johnny? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, because this storyline feels like it is heading somewhere explosive. And if you want more Days of Our Lives spoilers, deep analysis, and dramatic breakdowns of the stories that matter most, make sure to like this video, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you do not miss the next update.